This is a story of paradox, of how a living fortress of men and bayonets, against which the fiercest cavalry charges shattered for decades, transformed into a mass grave. How a symbol of unyielding discipline became synonymous with senseless slaughter. A tactic that brought Wellington victory at Waterloo would, just a few decades later, become a guaranteed death sentence on the battlefields of the American Civil War. To understand why a brilliant solution became a deadly trap, one must first grasp the scale of the threat it was designed to counter. Imagine an 18th century battlefield, the primary shock weapon, cavalry. These weren't just horsemen with sabers. These were hundreds of tons of living mass, charging at 40 kilometers per hour. The ground trembled. The roar of men and horses drowned out everything. For infantry standing in a thin line, such a blow was almost always fatal. French cuirassiers were particularly terrifying. Steel-clad horsemen with heavy broadswords, their helmets topped with long horsehair plumes. A charge by such a regiment was comparable to a modern multi-car pileup. Pure kinetic energy, designed for annihilation. When cavalry broke through the line, chaos ensued, the formation disintegrated, and soldiers transformed from a fighting unit into a fleeing mob. This is where the cavalry began its most dreadful work, pursuit and slaughter. Historians estimate that up to 80% of the losing side's casualties occurred not during the battle itself, but during the subsequent rout. Escaping a galloping horse in open country was impossible. Commanders faced a dilemma. The line offered maximum firepower, but was vulnerable. The column was good for a ramming charge, but defenseless on its flanks. The line was a glass cannon, powerful, but fragile. The column? A spear, strong at one point. Armies needed a versatile tool, a formation capable of defending itself on all four sides simultaneously. This solution came from ancient times, but it was reinterpreted for the age of gunpowder. Roman legions, too, formed dense formations to defend against cavalry. But their famous tortoise, testudo, was a passive shield against arrows. The new era gave birth to something different, a living hedgehog. The solution was the square, a hollow square of several hundred men, bristling with bayonets in all directions. It was simple geometry that became a formula for survival. It worked like this. The first rank on each side of the square knelt, bracing their musket butts against the ground. Their bayonets, angled precisely, created a steel barrier at the chest level of an attacking horse, forcing the animal to instinctively halt. The second and third ranks stood behind them, firing over their comrades' heads. In the relatively safe center were officers, standard-bearers, and drummers, whose rhythm turned reloading into a mechanical, continuous process amidst the chaos. The square had no flanks, no rear. It was a self-contained fortress. Its most crucial component, however, was invisible, psychology. Imagine an avalanche of steel and muscle bearing down on you. Your natural instinct screams, run. But the order, stand. The square's success rested on iron discipline and absolute trust in the man next to you. Soldiers had to endure this terrifying spectacle. Let the enemy approach almost to point-blank range, and only then, on command, deliver a single, devastating volley. The famous principle of "don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes" was not bravado, but a tactical necessity. Smoothbore muskets were only effective at 50 to 70 meters, and one perfectly aimed shot at close range decided everything. The tactic immediately proved its superiority. Horses, intelligent animals, simply refused to charge a wall of steel. In battles where cavalry once sowed panic, it now recoiled with heavy losses. Infantry no longer feared the open field. In 1798, at the foot of the Egyptian pyramids, Napoleon's 20,000-strong army formed into giant squares, faced an attack by 10,000 of the world's finest cavalry, the Mamluks. The outcome was shocking. The French lost only a few dozen men, completely annihilating their enemy. It was a victory not of weaponry, but of system and discipline. The Napoleonic Wars marked the golden age of the square. Napoleon himself, a master of decisive strikes, created an unprecedented cavalry hammer under the command of Marshal Murat. These were vast reserves designed to crush any army in a single moment. His main adversary, the British Duke of Wellington, countered with a steel anvil his infantry, trained to stand firm and withstand any charge. June 18, 1815. The field near the village of Waterloo. French Marshal Ney, dubbed the bravest of the brave, launched an attack of nearly 12,000 cuirassiers and lancers against the British positions. It was one of the largest and most desperate cavalry charges in history. Eyewitnesses described it as a sea of steel, glinting in the sun, that surged in waves against the British redcoats, and then recoiled, leaving a bloody foam of men and horses on the ground. Now, let's transport ourselves inside one of these squares. The air was thick, heavy with gunpowder smoke, to the point of being barely breathable. Only the rising thunder of thousands of hooves and the wild shouts of the attackers could be heard. Officers calmly walked within the formation, their voices steady and clear amidst the roar of battle. "Hold the line! Aim low!" Soldiers saw the glint of broadswords and the snarling faces of horses that seemed about to crash into them. They waited. Fire. A wall of fire and lead mowed down the first wave. The cavalry retreated to regroup, and it all began again. When an enemy cannonball did penetrate the formation, tearing several men to pieces, the chilling command rang out, "Close ranks!" And silently, mechanically, soldiers stepped aside, using the bodies of their fallen comrades to fill the empty space, restoring the integrity of the living wall. By the end of the day at Waterloo, it was clear no cavalry, however brave or numerous, could break disciplined infantry in a square. The tactic had been perfected to an absolute ideal. It became an axiom of warfare, a universal recipe for survival. Yet on that very same battlefield, another force was at play, already writing the next, far bloodier chapter in the book of military history. Ironically, Napoleon, a recognized artillery genius, couldn't effectively utilize his primary power at Waterloo, the ground, softened by overnight rain, absorbed the ricochet of cannonballs. The squares survived, but it was their last great victory. Their death warrant had already been signed by technological progress. For a long time, artillery was more a noisy than a decisive player on the battlefield. Cannons were cumbersome, inaccurate, and took an eternity to reload. Their cast-iron cannonballs flew in such a predictable arc that experienced soldiers could actually see them coming. A warning shout gave comrades a precious second to try and step aside. After hitting the ground, a cannonball would continue its path, bouncing like a giant bowling ball, and theoretically, one could step aside to let it pass. It was a dangerous, but localized and essentially understandable threat. But in the late 18th century, everything changed. French engineer Jean-Baptiste de Gribeauval implemented a reform that did for artillery what Henry Ford would later do for automobiles. He introduced standardization and interchangeable parts. Cannons became lighter, more reliable, and most importantly, more mobile. Cannons learned to move across the field at infantry pace, transforming from a static threat into a flexible tool in the hands of a commander. Along with the cannons, their ammunition also changed. Besides solid cannonballs, artillerists began to widely use canister shot, turning a cannon into a gigantic shotgun. A single shot from this iron broom mowed down everything alive within 200 to 300 meters. But even more terrifying was shrapnel, named after its British inventor, Henry Shrapnel. This was the first air-bursting projectile in history. A shell filled with musket balls exploded above the enemy's heads, showering them with a deadly rain. There was no escaping it. Napoleon himself, an artilleryman by training, understood the potential of this new power better than anyone. He stopped distributing cannons across the entire front. Instead, he gathered them into gigantic, grand batteries, concentrating the fire of dozens of barrels on a single sector. At the Battle of Wagram in 1809, his battery of 112 guns literally carved out an entire sector of the Austrian defense. Artillery was no longer a prelude to battle. It became its decisive act. And this is where the tactical equation flipped. The density that saved them from horsemen became a death sentence under cannon fire. The square presented an ideal target: 500 men packed onto a tiny patch of ground. For an artillerist of that era, shelling a square was like shooting at a barn door from 10 paces. A battalion occupying an area of just 20 by 20 meters was a juicy, stationary target. A single well-aimed cannonball could kill or wound up to 15 men, tearing through the formation. Missing was almost impossible. This was the trap. If both cavalry and artillery were present on the battlefield, infantry had no good options. Remain in line, be crushed by cavalry. Form a square, be shelled to pieces by cannons. It was a tactical zugzwang. Any move led to a worsening position. The enemy could use cavalry as bait, show it on the horizon, force the infantry to form dense boxes, and then calmly, from a safe distance, methodically, shell them. The Battle of Borodino in 1812 became a horrifying demonstration of this principle. Russian infantry, defending fortifications like the Revsky Redoubt, formed dense columns and squares, and hundreds of French guns rained fire upon them. For hours, soldiers stood under a hail of cannonballs, suffering colossal losses, but maintaining their formation. It was no longer a battle, but methodical extermination. At the Bagration Fleches, some Russian regiments lost up to 75% of their personnel, without even engaging in hand-to-hand combat. French General Pelé recalled, "The Russians did not retreat. They allowed themselves to be killed." The square transformed from a fortress into a cattle pen at a slaughterhouse. This was a new psychological hell. It was one thing to face an enemy attack you could see. It was quite another to stand still while an unseen enemy, a kilometer away, tore your comrades to pieces with impunity. Discipline, once the square's strength, now only forced soldiers to remain longer under a deadly rain. Napoleonic veterans claimed that enduring an artillery barrage was psychologically incomparably harder than any bayonet charge. It was the cold terror of utter helplessness. So why did generals continue to use a tactic that had become a deadly trap? The answer is simple. Military doctrines change agonizingly slowly, and new chapters are written in blood. The square had worked for decades, It was in every manual, ingrained in every officer's mind. Generals who became heroes at Waterloo wrote manuals for the next generation, and their personal experience, where the square was the key to victory, became an unshakable dogma. To abandon the square was, for them, tantamount to abandoning the very idea of discipline. The next bloody lesson was delivered by the American Civil War. Although classic squares were rarely used there, the very philosophy of dense formations faced an even more formidable enemy, the rifled musket. The Springfield rifle increased effective firing range from 70 meters to 400. Now, not only cannons, but every infantryman could fire upon dense ranks from a safe distance. Pickett's charge at Gettysburg became a horrifying demonstration of this fact. It was an 18th century march directly into 19th century fire. The answer to the new threat was dispersal. Instead of ideal geometric figures, infantry began to use skirmish lines and rifle chains. Soldiers learned to dig in, to hide behind terrain features. The main goal shifted from maintaining formation to reducing density and vulnerability. Military art shifted from geometry to geography. Using terrain became more important than an ideal line. The Prussians were the first to fully grasp this, their tactics crushing the French in 1870. And yet, the square remained in the arsenal for colonial wars. Against an enemy without modern artillery, it still worked. In asymmetric conflicts of the 19th century, for example, at the Battle of Ulundi, against the Zulus in 1879, the British square, bristling with rifles and Gatling guns, transformed into an unbreakable killing machine. It was the last, brutal echo of its former glory. Thus, the history of the infantry square is a classic military tragedy. It was a brilliant solution to a specific problem: how to stop cavalry. It required incredible courage and discipline to function. But as soon as technology changed the rules of the game, introducing powerful artillery, the square's main strengths, its density and immobility, turned into fatal weaknesses. It's like the story of a knight in shining armor. His armor, invulnerable to swords, made him an easy target for the first bullet. His greatest defense became his deadliest trap. This is a lesson that extends far beyond battlefields. In war, as in evolution, there are no eternal, perfect solutions. Any system is strong only within its own context. And the greatest danger is blind faith in one's own invulnerability, the inability to adapt to changing conditions. The price of such an error is measured in thousands of lives sacrificed to an outdated, though once great, doctrine. It's the story of Kodak, which invented digital photography, but clung to the film business that made it a giant until the very end. Success breeds dogma, and dogma leads to demise. And this makes one wonder, what are the square formations of today? What symbols of power might prove vulnerable to threats we are only beginning to recognize? Take the modern aircraft carrier. It's a floating fortress worth $13 billion. A square of steel protecting 5,000 people. For decades, it was the undisputed king of the ocean. But has it not already become an ideal target for hypersonic missiles, the so-called carrier killers? The lesson of the square. It's not just history. It's an eternal warning that today's most reliable fortress might be tomorrow's easiest target. The question is, who will realize it first?